My name is Patrick J. McGinnis, and I coined the term FOMO. That's short for fear of missing out, and it's why some people end up following the crowd. But we're not like them. We're part of a new species that isn't afraid to do things differently. I call us FOMO Sapiens. And this is the show where you'll meet people like us, phenomenal FOMO Sapiens, to learn how they find the courage and the ideas to live exceptional lives. FOMO. FOMO. Welcome back to FOMO Sapiens, the show for people who don't just follow the crowd, but instead take their own path to success in business and in life. I'm your host, Patrick J. McGinnis, venture capitalist by day, author and podcast group by night, and FOMO Sapiens 24/7. Now, today is a really, I think it's a great episode. I'm very excited about it because we're going to be joined by the creator of the concept called the Lean Startup. There was a book called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. Eric was the student of Steve Blank, and so Steve is here with us to talk about the concept and how he and Pete Newell, who comes out of the military, are applying it at Stanford and all over the world to innovate in areas like military and climate and government. So it's a really interesting look at this concept, the Lean Startup, which I super love. It changed my life when I read Eric Ries's book. And when I found out that we're going to have Steve on the show, I was just very excited because I remember when I read that book and I read about Steve and learned about his work, I just thought this person is changing the way that startups are built. The idea you have to have tons and tons of money and that you just sort of build a startup in a laboratory and you don't actually go out into the real world and figure out what works before you spend money to build it. The idea that we would change the way we do things has made so many things possible. That's why you can start a company with very little money. And that's why we have so much more entrepreneurs out there today. So it's just a seminal work. And we're going to talk about the story behind the Lean Startup. We're going to talk about the work that Steve and Pete are doing right now. So in addition to creating the Lean Startup methodology, Steve is an adjunct professor at Stanford and a senior fellow for innovation at Columbia, and he has been described as the father of modern entrepreneurship. He's written 2 books, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany and The Startup Owner's Manual, and he blogs at steveblank.com. Now, Pete Newell is a nationally recognized innovation expert whose work is transforming how the government and other large organizations compete and drive growth. He started his career in the military and he retired as an Army colonel, and he is currently the CEO of BMNT. He has written a book with Steve Blank, so I guess Steve has 3 books now, and that book is called Hacking for Defense, and together they teach this course, Hacking for Defense, both at Stanford as well as all over the world. Now, on today's show, obviously, I've got Steve here. I'm not going to blow it and forget to ask him about the story behind the Lean Startup and what is the Lean Startup. So if you are familiar with it but can't quite remember, or if you haven't heard about it, you basically get like a free semester of a Stanford class in about 4 minutes. It's masterful how he explains it. Then we're going to talk about how Steve and Pete are applying this to solve really big problems and getting young people excited about doing something that has a benefit for the public, not just going to work for a social media company. And finally, we're going to get a very interesting take from each of them about what separates the great entrepreneurs from the rest, because they're teaching entrepreneurs, so they get to see lots of people and they get to see who sinks and who swims and what separates the two. All right, before we get to the interview, though, I do have my small ask, and my small ask is this. If you know somebody who is a fan of the Lean Startup, send them this episode, share it with them, and then suggest that they kindly subscribe and give a rating to the show because that helps more people discover it. All right, and now on to the interview. So as you know, I like to start every interview with the same question, and today is no exception. So I started by asking Steve this question. What's the most important decision that you've had to make to get to where you are today?
I guess I'd have to say, having been in the military, and Pete being in the military is the antithesis of military advice, which says never volunteer for anything. I, in fact, volunteered for everything. I showed up more than most people, and that just changed my life. I stuck out my thumb, saw where it would go, and when other people were choosing safety and security and a set of knowns, I was more comfortable discovering what was over the next hill. That changed my career almost every year. It still does.
That's FOMO Sapiens right there. I'm the same way, and I think a lot of people who listen to the show are. Now, I do want to start because, Steve is somebody who many of you know his work. He is the creator of the Lean Startup, and the book of the same title by Eric Ries was a big hit. And I remember I read that book on a plane in 2008, And I had come out of venture capital where we plowed tons of money into companies that failed, and money was getting wasted here and there. And I read that book, and I remember where I was when I read the book, that first chapter. It kind of broke my head a little bit, and it made me see the world a different way. So I am definitely a Steve Blank fan. And I just want to, for people who maybe, they're familiar with it, but they haven't had the chance to hear it from your mouth, tell us about the lean startup philosophy, because I think, it's just a great way to start our conversation.
Great. So you could get the entire semester class in about 3 minutes here. But, and I'll try to make it in one sentence, which is, or two sentences. One is the big observation is startups weren't smaller versions of large companies, which as a VC, that is a big duh. That's probably $1 billion insight right there, is that large companies execute what we now call known business models, but startups search for them. And that distinction between search and execution had never been articulated before. And the other famous line about lean is, therefore, there are no facts inside your building, so get the hell outside. Because all you have on day one is a series of untested assumptions, which really makes a startup a faith-based enterprise, a religious activity, until you turn that faith into facts. So that technically, the lean startup really is the work of three people. My observation is that there are no facts inside the building. So I developed a methodology called customer development, which said, hey, well, if so, let's get out and talk to people, not a giant focus group, but to inform the founder's vision. And that's a key distinction. We're not adding up all the feature requests. We're trying to understand, are we in the right place, talking to the right people, trying to find what Mark Andreessen coined product market fit, the fit between the customers and the potential thing you're building, whether it's a product or service. Eric Ries's contribution, who was my best student ever, was, look, Steve, you've invented customer development, but you grew up in a world of waterfall engineering where you built the product serially. Look, in the 21st century, software and hardware people are figuring out how to build products iteratively and interactively. So while you're outside that building, why don't we build what we now call minimum viable products? I call them minimum feature sets in my book. Eric had I thought, a better name called minimum viable products, and put them in front of these customers you're talking to, so you can not only get, kind of qualitative data, you get quantitative reactions to the things you're building. And by the way, when you're showing them those MVPs, you could do something that no VC in the 20th century allowed you to do, and that's change your mind. And change your mind based on real data. It used to be the only real hard facts we have is you build the product and alpha test, beta test, first customer ship, and then only then, and back then then meant years, would you get actual feedback and find out the product wasn't selling. Here you could get feedback early, and you could do something called a pivot, a substantive change to whatever you're building, or to who the customers are, or whether the pricing is wrong or the channel is wrong. And then the third piece of lean, so first is customer development, second is agile engineering, and the third was, well, what hypothesis should I be testing? That is, what assumptions? Is it customers? Is it channels? And whatever. Well, someone named Alexander Osterwalder had just written a book called Business Model Design, and he came up with something called the Business Model Canvas, which was in a single piece of paper. I'd say about 80 to 90% of what you need to test was on a single diagram. And we kind of adopted the business model canvas of, okay, while you're out the building, here's the roadmap. In case you forget, go back and validate, write down all your assumptions, use yellow sticky notes because you're going to be changing them. And this is what we're testing with our customer development and agile engineering MVPs. So in a nutshell, that's lean. It's those three components: customer development, agile engineering, and the business model canvas. And, the Valley kind of adopted it, but there were no classes. Big businesses didn't use it. And then the world changed in a couple of ways we'll talk about a bit later, one with Pete Newell showing up, and the other when the Harvard Business Review put it on its cover. But that's the semester in maybe 3.5 minutes.
Yeah, and there's so much in there, but I would say if I could, I would bake that into my oatmeal and eat it for breakfast every morning, because it is like, I've seen it as somebody who's invested in companies all over the world and traveled all over the world, whether you're in Buenos Aires or you're in Colombia or you're in Bangladesh, like, people are talking about this methodology and building companies. So it's really changed the world. FOMO. Now, you mentioned Pete. I have Pete right here, and I want to bring you in, Pete, now because you come out of the Army. You've been in the defense world, and you teamed up with Steve to create this concept called hacking defense. Now, it's interesting because there's always been a relationship between the university world and the defense world, right? Especially because in the early days of venture capital, so much of the money that built the industry came from the government. But I'm curious. Now we're farther along. How did you end up teaming up with Steve to build this program?
So you asked the question about what one decision I made that did the most to get me where I am today. In the middle of working on a project for a government client, when I didn't have time to do anything, I agreed to have coffee with a guy who I'd never met. And I freed up 20 minutes to sit down and talk to Steve Blank. And it turned into a 4.5-hour conversation on a couple of dry erase boards. And that single act allowed, serendipity to strike, which has now struck multiple times. And that's probably the genesis of most of whatever happened. It was a completely accidental meeting that turned into, I guess, the understanding that, I was running the Army's skunk works before I came to Silicon Valley. And the model that I used to pull problems off the battlefield and boil them down into projects and call those things down into things that we actually would incubate and deliver back, when drawn on a dry erase board, looked exactly like what Steve had been doing. We had different start points. He started with opportunities and I started with problems, but the dialogue we had on the diagrams were nearly identical. We just used different language. Much to Steve's credit, and I think the benefit of the country, on the way out the door, he stopped and he said, "We're going to take everything I've ever done with Lean, and we're going to combine it with what you do, and we're going to help the country." And that was the genesis for what we were doing. The actual hacking for defense, I credit a student in the back of the room one day with causing it to happen. So this project I was working on was based on the premise that you can take a government problem using words that nobody understands and translate that into plain language, and then further do discovery with people outside the military to discover that problem's digital twin in the commercial world, translate it again, and recruit people to work on the problem because it's important to both. So that was what this exercise was about. We were doing the outbrief for that with, and I met Steve in the middle of this, but we're outbriefing this with former SecDef Bill Perry, who was at Stanford, plus a bunch of other luminaries. And one of the students from Stanford who we had recruited, was in the room. And finally, we looked at Bill Perry at the end of this and said, this was great. I used a bunch of Stanford students over spring break, and it was a great project, and it was fascinating. However, it's not scalable because Stanford students, during the year, quite frankly, they got classes, they're busy, and they don't do side work. And the students stood up in the back of the room and said, "Wait a minute, at this point, a class at Stanford, I would have taken it." And 30 seconds later, Bill Perry and Steve Blank are looking at each other going, "Guess what you guys are going to do? We're going to create a class called Hacking for Defense at Stanford University." Yeah, Steve, what was it? 9 months later, we kicked off the first class.
Yeah, I think a lot quicker, but it's a testament to where we teach as well. Is that Stanford and our department in the engineering school, MS&E, allows us to stand up new classes at an alarming rate, at least for a university, and allowed us to kind of test this out. And it was a spinoff of the existing Lean Launchpad class we had been teaching, but still, their flexibility in allowing us to do that. And as you pointed out, Stanford and Silicon Valley have a long history in connection of supporting the country in different ways. So yeah, it was kind of exciting. And for my motivation, Patrick, was at the same time Pete was doing this and running his military career through a couple of decades and a couple of battlefields. I had spent 4 years in the Air Force during Vietnam, and And actually, in my entire Silicon Valley career and as an educator, it's always stuck in my mind that the country actually did itself a massive disservice when we ended any form of national service. And I don't mean just the draft. I just mean, some form of having 18-year-olds connect with people outside their cultural ghettos or silos. And that Facebook and social media has actually amplified that disconnection in the last 5 years or so. And I just thought any way to kind of get students working on mission-driven things, whether it was defense or diplomacy or climate or something, could be, a very small but important contribution to bringing the country together. And this was even before it got even further apart than it is today. So the same time we spun up hacking for defense, we also spun up hacking for diplomacy at Stanford simultaneously. I was working with Pete on defense and Professor Jeremy Weinstein and at Stanford and Zvika Krieger, who was the State Department's technical representative to Silicon Valley, and both started simultaneously. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but was pleasantly surprised that students were equally interested in working on other people's problems, that is mission driven entrepreneurship, than they were their problems. And so that's how I ended up there.
I love it. You're giving a sneak peek to some future guests, because we'll have Jeremy on the show coming up a little later. Now, I think a lot of people, when they think about innovation, it's like oftentimes, we think about the consumer innovation or software or business, but the military, it is a huge organization with very talented people, with a very large percentage of our budget in the United States going to fund all of these operations. It has global reach. So, Pete, I'd love to, as somebody who, is from the military and spent your career there before you went off to start your own company, what are the types of challenges that you are trying to solve for that address the needs of the modern military?
And so, first I would say is that there are only a couple of problems within DoD that don't have twins in the commercial world someplace. And oftentimes is we just talk about them differently, but I'm finding that 99% of the time, if I express a problem that DoD is working on, given enough time, I can find not just one, but several different places in the commercial world where that problem pops up again. The big things, and you'd be surprised, is obviously there's a lot of the how do we use AI and machine learning, and how are we going to ramp up autonomy, and but as you peel those problems back, you find out it's first it's about computer science, and second there's material science side to it. Because what are the new composites and new energy systems that we're going to drive completely new systems of things? If you think about the advent of quantum, quantum will require new data centers that have to be super energy efficient, but they're also going to require new transmission lines for information. So 5G, 6G, 7G, that then opens up the opportunity to create new sensor systems that gather data that we never considered useful. So it's really complex, but at the same time, it's not. We have 56 universities in the United States this year teaching hacking for defense. There are 15 more in the UK and I think 4 in Australia. Yeah, and amongst those, as we source the problems that we send to the universities, I would say that probably 30 to 40% are related to data. How to capture it, how to store it. Data analysts, and these days, jokingly refer to themselves as data janitors. Is they're not actually doing analysis; they're merely trying to move the data around and make sense of it. So data makes up a lot of it, and there are lots of background text. There are a lot of business process and policy issues related to the speed at which tech is being brought in and attempted to use. So surprisingly, the class doesn't just touch tech. We're actually dealing with the policy issues around, we had policies written in the 60s and 70s before anybody ever thought that some of this tech, it was all Buck Rogers stuff back then. you now have to sort out because the policies actually prevent you from using the tech to the extent that it will do what it was intended to, yet we keep trying to bring it in. So I can talk problems, everything from how you hire people to how you keep them to the systems you actually use to weapon systems. It touches everything, quite frankly.
Yeah, so it's not just guns and bombs. It's about running a large organization, and you can translate those over into the private sector as well, which I think a lot of people probably didn't, I hadn't sort of intuitively thought of that as I was researching this program. Now, Steve, I'd love to, as you have taken students through this all over the world, I'd love to just hear a story, kind of a favorite story of an innovation that has come out of this process that, has a chance to really do something big in the world.
Well, Pete and I laugh is that in our first class, there was a set of scientists and engineers from Stanford who had this crazy idea of replacing the billion-dollar Battlestar Galactica satellites we have that look through clouds using something called synthetic aperture radar. And historically, these were big, expensive, as I said, Battlestar Galacticas. And they wanted to build a series instead of distributed CubeSats, which were something the size of a small microwave rather than a small bus. And gee, that's not possible technically. And then how would that work? And who would the customer be? Because who else needs to see through clouds? And it was a company called Capella Space. And of course, now, fast forward 5 years later, they actually have CubeSats on orbit, and the National Reconnaissance Office is their customer, and so are some civilian agencies who want to track illegal fishing fleets and other things going on. So that was kind of an amazing, your students come in and say, we're going to build our own satellites. And by the way, we're going to launch them on rockets which barely were available at the time, which were SpaceX Falcon 9s. And so that's been one that's been great to watch because everybody kind of quotes Capella Space now as a company that could start literally in someone's dorm room and end up in orbit. And that's probably my favorite example.
FOMO. Don't think small, I think is the takeaway there. The great thing about the lean startup methodology is you can have a big idea, but you can start small to get there, and maybe you even launch a satellite out of your dorm room, which is, well, I mean, that happens at Stanford every day. Now, I'm curious, we're in an environment, and you sort of alluded to this, Steve, where the connection is fraying. People are not connected to each other. The national service is not happening. We're seeing side effects in our society of people just not being able to talk to each other. And at the same time, you have all these talented kids graduating from schools like Stanford and others who can go to the private sector and get paid a lot of money and, don't have to even think about doing something for their country. And so I want to ask each one of you, but I'm just curious. I'll start with you, Pete. Yes, there are private sector applications to the things that people are developing, but there is also, there's an important part of it, which is wanting to do something to make the world a better place. And, I think especially with the diplomacy work, for example, or some of these, the military does a lot of good things, and protects our country and is out there helping people all over the world. How do you convince the young people who, may be looking at the bright, shiny riches being dangled down the road in Silicon Valley that they should spend some time solving problems for the military and for the government?
Yeah, I would say it's not nearly as hard as you think it is. And first, I'll say it this way. I want to disavow people of the idea that you have to join the military or the government to actually perform a national public service. And I think we proved that with a Hacking for Defense class. I will tell you, every student that steps in that room or steps foot in the room, every mentor from industry who joins us, every professor that steps in, all of them are helping validate that the military intelligence agencies are working on the right problems for the right reasons, and they are producing answers to things that they just wouldn't have access to. So that's one. The second is Steve has so eloquently laid out in the past, is that we have inverted the relationship of how technology comes into the government. So it's no longer government-generated tech that's so critical. It's stuff coming from the civilian agencies. So um, by going off to commercial companies that are working on things that are important, both commercially and to the government, and by helping those companies find a path to actually work with the government, a lot of these students are actually performing a more important service than they would if they'd actually sat at a desk inside the Pentagon. And we have dozens of them that, anecdotally, 60% of the students who take the Hacking for Defense class go on to continue working with the problem sponsor afterward, either directly or indirectly. Some, in fact, join the military or join an intelligence agency or do something else. But fully, 60% keep up with the work that they were doing. So in many cases, we call Hacking for Defense probably the best civics class in the world. But it's giving students the opportunity to learn about the military and the government while working on a problem that's important with real people that gives them real experience that will be useful for the rest of their lives. So I think it truly is one of the best opportunities for them to gain some insight while performing a national public service that is then a model for them for the rest of their lives. And to realize they can work in a commercial world and still do this, and it's still important work.
And Steve, how do you see the sort of the challenge, or I guess, Pete, it doesn't sound like it's that much of a challenge, but of getting people excited about working on innovations that have, real implications for military and government?
If you're an innovator, you tend to be capable of seeing over the horizon, at least over the next hill, better than most people. And one of the things that's becoming apparent in the last 5 years, and certainly in the last year or so, is that the U.S. and now China are kind of feel like the 1930s in the United States. There's a neo-totalitarian view in China what the world looks like, and there's a messy democratic view of what the world looks like for democratic regimes, and they're going to come into conflict more and more. And students now have an interesting choice. Do you join hot social media companies that now have a track record of actually tearing the country apart? I consider, by the way, my students who still who send their resumes to those companies kind of failed the class. It's like, really, you can't get a job elsewhere? Versus, there's kind of a rising challenge to not just your personal beliefs, but maybe, and not just the U.S.'s footprint for national power, but kind of a global challenge of how do we want to see the world in the next 10 or 20 years? And, go ask the people in Hong Kong how that turns out, or even the Uyghurs in Western China. It's not been working well, and that's not the world I think I want to live in or have my students or my kids live in. And the smart students, I think, are rising to that occasion. They're understanding it's more than an interesting class. It's might be the challenge for their generation.
I want to end by asking each of you, what separates the truly great students that you work with from, the rest of the crowd? So, Pete, I'll start with you.
You're creating this new class of mission-driven entrepreneurs who are people who are attracted to the idea of solving the hardest possible problem they can find and building the perfect network to attack it. And then, using the tools that we've taught them actually to grow something much bigger. In some cases, like Capella Space, it's build a company. And Payam, the CEO of that company, tell you today, he still applies what he learned in the class 5 years later. It is still an integral part of the company he's building. So I would just say that, that in itself is just recognizing the art and science of being an entrepreneur is so many different skill sets wrapped in one. And I think that so many of the students walk out of this class having experienced what it's like to do it under pressure, that many of them realize that entrepreneurship is their calling, and many others realize that I'm happy to support an entrepreneur, but that's not going to be me. And I think the class has done a tremendous job at teaching young people about themselves and about each other.
All right, Steve, last word to you.
Well, a couple things about entrepreneurs is that, at least for founders, they're closer to artists than any other profession. They see things that other people don't, or hear things or can envision, when everybody else just sees fog, they actually see through the fog and can see the end result. But for personality traits, successful ones, you ask the question, who stands out and what traits they have. They're relentless. They're agile. They're incredibly curious. I mean, they don't take the walls that people painted around them as kind of givens. They go, well, that's great, but like those aren't my rules, and they move forward. And you don't want the entire populace doing that, or we would have chaos. But I think throughout history, there's always been a subset of human beings who weren't satisfied with what we had. And wanted something better and figured out how to make it. And, if that's you who are listening, welcome to the club. It's a recessive gene, but it's in fact what makes the human race move forward. It's these iconoclasts who, create things that we never had before. And it makes the world quite interesting and hopefully for the better.
All right. Pete Newell and Steve Blank, thanks so much for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks for having us.
FOMO. If you like today's show, please be sure to rate it and recommend it to your friends. And as always, you can find me on Instagram at Patrick J. McGinnis, on Twitter at PJ McGinnis, and on the web at FOMOSapiens.com or PatrickMcGinnis.com, where you can get all kinds of free resources to live a more decisive and entrepreneurial life. FOMO Sapiens is recorded in New York City. Theme music is by Mike McGinnis, and editing and post-production is by Josh Elstro. If you like today's show, please be sure to rate it and recommend it to your friends. And as always, you can find me at FOMOSapiens.com and at PatrickMcGinnis.com. To advertise on FOMO Sapiens, reach out to contact@FOMOSapiens.com. FOMO.